I want to talk about income inequality and what happens with the corporations, but let's be practical. You're not going to be able to make a whole lot of changes legally until you get the votes for it. So in order to get the votes for it, let's talk about what happened with the primaries yesterday. Give us your assessment of what we saw in Pennsylvania and in the other states for that matter.
Well, we saw a lot of good news, I think. We saw women candidates successful. We saw voter turnout increasing. We saw candidates who are carrying a message of economic shared prosperity win and be successful, including in Nebraska. And so I think that overall the trend lines are good. What I'll say is that any candidate running should address the kitchen table issues that families all over this country are dealing with, which is high rent, which is unaffordable college, which is perilous retirements. And these kind of things should inform us as we go out on the campaign trail and talk to voters.
Yeah, as you say, women did particularly well, and in fact, we're finally not going to have all men representing the state of Pennsylvania in this House and the Senate, which would be nice. Yeah, exactly. It's overdue. But at the same time, you as deputy chair of the Democratic National Committee have to think about winning the general, not just what happens in the primary. And are you satisfied that you will have candidates who can win, that the party's not going too far in the progressive direction, which frankly is one that you would favor? People like Connor Lamb.
Well, let me tell you, I'm not really favoring a left or right direction. I'm favoring a responsive direction. I don't think we should go left or right. I think we should go to the grassroots. Connor Lamb talked about how the tax bill was going to affect ordinary families. He talked about basic issues of kitchen table survivability. He talked about the future, sending kids to college, and how are we going to make sure that we train the next generation of workers. These practical things may sound progressive, but the truth is they're supported by large numbers of the American people because income inequality has gotten so extreme that people just have to have policymakers pay attention to their lives.
Talking about going far into one direction, what about talk of impeachment? Would that help or hurt the Democrats?
Well, I understand why people talk about it. There have been very, very concerning things the president has done and is doing. But for me, I'm going to keep my focus on Ms. McGillicuddy. I'm going to keep my focus on making sure she can earn a decent living, that she can have a retirement she can look forward to, that her kids can aspire to afford college. That is where I'm going to spend most of my time. Of course, we're not going to ignore the other things, but I think the bulk of our time needs to be focused on fighting for an economy that Americans can survive in and thrive in. That's where we need to focus.
To your point, there's a new report about the pay discrepancy between workers and CEOs. Tell us a little bit about the findings there.
Thank you. Well, so as you know, under the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act, it became required that the publicly traded companies would have to report the ratio between CEO pay and the median worker. It took a while, about 5 years or more, for the Securities Exchange Commission to promulgate a rule, but they finally did. So now we have a data set of about 225 publicly traded companies. And yeah, we found the CEOs are paid exorbitant amounts of money compared to their workers, but how bad and extreme it was really was even shocking to me. So, for example, you talk about a company like Mattel, their CEO makes almost 5,000 times more than the average worker. You get companies like The Gap, their CEO makes, well over 1,000 times more than the average worker. McDonald's, the same thing. And some of the companies come back and say, well, yeah, we got a lot of part-time workers. But what we know is that companies make people work part-time strategically so they don't have to take on costs such as health care benefits and retirement and things like that. So it's not like people don't want to work full-time. They would love to, but companies make sure that they don't. And then other companies come back and say, well, what about our workers that work overseas? They have a lower cost of living. Well, that just means that you're offshoring to places where the wages are low, the environmental protections are low, the workers' rights are low, the human rights are low, so you can make a lot of money. what about hiring American workers who have environmental, human rights, and labor protections and paying a fair wage? What about that?
But Congressman, if you really want to make progress in this area, and I'm sure
Yes.
a lot of people would be troubled the way you're troubled, is it enough to just get disclosure? Because I think that's what you're advocating. I mean, this is not a big secret to shareholders. It's not a big secret to boards of directors. Don't you need direct government intervention? Are you favoring the government actually regulating the relationship between CEO pays and the average worker?
I think it's a very good idea, and I think we should start talking about it. I think, but I want to go further than that. I'd like to see shareholders say, wait a minute, what's going on with my dividend? Wait a minute, what kind of risks are you taking on to get these exorbitant amounts of money that could end up imperiling the company? I think that this is a broad conversation that needs to, of course, take in policymakers like me, but shareholders and investors need to be worried about this too, because I don't think this leads to the overall health of the economy, the company. I think it takes care of a few people at the very tip top.